The scent of lemon polish and ammonia was the only language she was supposed to understand. It was a sharp, clean smell that cut through the silence of the 58th floor. Jade moved the mop in slow, deliberate arcs, the wet fibers kissing the Italian marble. Figure 8. Turn, repeat. Her movements were a silent prayer, a meditation in invisibility. The dark blue uniform was a shadow, the white apron a surrender. She was a ghost who came after dark, erasing the day's smudges and footprints, leaving behind nothing but a sterile gleam and the lingering ghost of citrus. For 6 months, she had been deaf. It was a lie, of course. A shield. A survival mechanism as essential as breathing. When she'd taken the night cleaning job for the private equity firm Tatsumi Holdings, she'd learned on the first day that the less you knew, the longer you lasted. The men who worked here moved with the coiled stillness of predators. Their suits were too sharp, their whispers too low, their eyes missing the flat, corporate boredom she saw in other downtown offices. So, on her second night, Jade had simply stopped reacting to sound. She'd learned to watch reflections in the polished floors and chrome fixtures. She felt vibrations through the soles of her worn sneakers. She became a master of the periphery, an observer who saw everything and heard nothing. Her world was one of textures and light. The buttery softness of the leather on the guest chairs. The cold, unforgiving bite of the steel desk legs. The way the city lights of Los Angeles fractured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floor she had just mopped. Tonight, the air was different. It was heavy, charged with a tension that felt like ozone before a lightning strike. He was here. She didn't need to see him to know. The atmosphere in the building shifted when Ryosuke Tatsumi was present. The silence became deeper, more absolute. He moved like the room owed him space, and the very air seemed to part for him. She continued her work, her back to the office entrance, her focus entirely on the rhythmic glide of the mop. It was her armor, the steady, mindless work of a deaf girl who knew her place. The sound of his shoes on the marble was a low, expensive whisper. 2 other sets of footsteps flanked him, heavier, less graceful. She could feel their vibrations through the handle of her mop. They stopped just inside the main office area, a vast expanse of dark wood and glass that overlooked the sprawling city. A voice began to speak in Japanese. It was low, guttural, laced with a fury that was barely contained. Jade kept mopping, her movements fluid and unbroken. She didn't understand the words, but the tone was universal. Accusation. Betrayal. Another voice answered, this one higher, pleading. It was cut off by a third voice, the one that belonged to the silence itself. Ryosuke's voice. It was not loud. It was never loud. It was a cold, precise instrument that sliced through the tension, and the other 2 men fell silent immediately. He spoke for a long time. His cadence was calm, almost conversational, but the vibrations of it felt like chips of ice against her skin. She was near the far wall of windows now, her reflection a muted blue shape against the glittering tapestry of the city. She could see them in the glass. 3 dark-suited figures. The 2 men stood stiffly, their heads bowed. The third, Ryosuke, was a study in lethal stillness. Even as a distorted reflection, his presence was absolute. Ink, dark and intricate, peeked from beneath the cuff of his white shirt and the sharp collar, a whisper of the world he truly commanded. Jade squeezed the water from her mop into the bucket, the small splash and squeak the only sound she was allowed to make. She was just part of the scenery, a necessary, but invisible, function of the building. She told herself this every night. She was nobody. She was safe. The conversation ended, not with a shout, but with a chilling finality. 2 sharp sounds followed, close together. They were soft, wet thuds. She didn't flinch. Her training was too good. Her body remained a mask of oblivious calm. The 2 heavier sets of footsteps moved away, dragging something with them. The sound was a dull scrape on the marble she had just polished. She would have to mop it again. Now there was only 1 set of footsteps. His. They moved from the center of the room, not towards the exit, but toward her. Don't look up. Don't stop moving. You can't hear him. You don't know he's there. The mantra repeated in her head. She dipped the mop back into the bucket, her movements practiced and smooth. He stopped a few feet behind her. She could feel his stillness at her back, a tangible pressure. The air grew cold. The scent of his cologne, something clean and sharp like cedarwood and smoke, cut through the chemical smell of the polish. He said nothing. The silence stretched, becoming a weapon. He was waiting, testing her. She refused to break. She was a deaf cleaner. She was mopping the floor. That was her entire world. She pulled the mop out, ready for the next section of the floor, turning her body slightly as she did. That was the moment everything changed. From the corner of his jacket, something small and silver slipped free. It arced through the air, catching the light, and hit the marble floor with a distinct, high-pitched tink. It was a sound no louder than a falling coin. A sound a truly deaf person would never register. But for a fraction of a second, a synaptic misfire born of pure reflex, Jade's eyes flickered down towards the source of the noise. It was an infinitesimal movement, a twitch of the muscle, a dart of the pupil. She caught herself instantly, her gaze snapping back to the meaningless point on the wall ahead of her, her heart seizing in her chest. It was too late. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer passive. It was predatory. She could feel his eyes on her, not as a casual glance, but as a focused, analytical stare. She knew, with a certainty that turned the blood in her veins to ice, that he had seen it. In this world of hypervigilance, a world she had only glimpsed in reflections, such a small mistake was a confession. Slowly, deliberately, he walked around her until he stood in her line of sight. He bent down, his movements economical and precise, and picked up the object. It was a silver cufflink, shaped like a stylized dragon. He held it between his thumb and forefinger. He didn't speak. He just watched her face. Jade kept her expression placid, empty. She stared through him, at the city lights behind his head. She was deaf. She had seen nothing, heard nothing, but the lie felt thin and brittle, like a sheet of ice about to crack. He took a step closer. He was tall, his bespoke suit fitting his frame in a way that spoke of quiet, immense power. His face was carved from stone, all sharp angles and disciplined lines. But his eyes were ancient, dark and intelligent. They saw everything she was trying so desperately to hide. He lifted his free hand and gently, almost mockingly, tapped his own ear. A slow, knowing smile touched the corner of his mouth. It was not a friendly expression. It was the smile of a hunter who has just cornered its prey. Then he reached out and, with a chilling finality, his fingers closed around the handle of the door to his private office, and she heard the solid, definitive click of the lock. The sound echoed in the vast, silent room, a death knell for the girl who was only supposed to smell of lemon polish. The lie was over, and she was trapped inside with the truth. "Let's start again," he said, his voice a low murmur that vibrated through the floor. It was the first time he had ever spoken to her, and his English was perfect, unaccented, and terrifyingly calm. "What did you hear, cleaner?" Her name was Jade. She was 18 years old, a freshman at UCLA, and for the last 6 months, she had pretended to be deaf to survive. Now, she was locked in a room 58 stories above the city with the head of the Yakuza, and he knew she had heard everything. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden, absolute silence. Her carefully constructed world of deafness had shattered with the sound of a single, falling cufflink. Ryosuke Tatsumi watched her, his expression unreadable, his stillness a physical weight in the room. He rolled the silver dragon cufflink between his fingers, the movement hypnotic and menacing. "I asked you a question," he repeated, his voice no louder than before, but the edge in it was sharper. Jade's mind raced. To deny it now was pointless. He had seen the flicker in her eyes, the involuntary reaction that had betrayed her. To lie further would be an insult to his intelligence, and she suspected that was a fatal mistake. Her survival instinct, the one that had guided her for so long, screamed at her to find a new path. Honesty, a carefully curated version of it, was the only weapon she had left. She let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding and finally met his gaze. "I heard tension," she said, her voice raspy from disuse in this building. "I don't speak Japanese." A flicker of something, surprise? Interest, crossed his features. "But you heard the sound of this," he held up the cufflink. She gave a small, stiff nod. "Yes. For 6 months, you have worked in this building. Every report I have received from my security staff describes the night cleaner as deaf and mute." He took a step closer, invading her space. The scent of cedar and smoke was stronger now, clean and masculine and utterly out of place with the ammonia clinging to her uniform. Why the deception? This was the critical moment. The truth had to be strategic. "To be invisible," she said, her voice gaining a little strength. "No one pays attention to the deaf girl. No one worries about what she might overhear. It's safer to hear nothing." Ryosuke's dark eyes searched her face, dissecting her words, her expression, her posture. He was looking for lies, for weakness. She forced herself to stand still, to not shrink away from his predatory proximity. She was a cleaner, but she was not weak. He was silent for a long moment, then a low, humorless chuckle escaped him. "Safer," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "An intelligent calculation." Misguided, but intelligent, he gestured to the sprawling office. "You heard the men I was speaking with tonight. You heard them leave. You did not hear them use the elevator." A cold dread washed over her. The wet thuds. The scraping sound. She had known, but she had pushed the knowledge down, locked it away. "You have heard too much to be invisible anymore, Jade," he said. Her name on his lips was a shock. He knew her name. Of course he did. He knew everything that happened in his empire. "Your lie has made you interesting. And in my world, interesting is dangerous." He turned and walked to his desk, a massive slab of obsidian that reflected the city lights. He placed the cufflink down with a quiet click. "Your employment with the cleaning company is terminated. As of now, you work for me." Panic, sharp and acidic, rose in her throat. I can't. I have school. I didn't see anything. I won't say anything to anyone. I swear." "I know you won't," he said, turning back to face her, "because you will not be leaving. You will continue to clean, but only here. My private suite. My office. You will live in one of the residential suites on the 60th floor. You will be a ghost, as you intended, but you will be my ghost." It wasn't the negotiation. It was a declaration. She was a prisoner, a gilded cage on the 60th floor, but a cage nonetheless. The life she knew, her tiny apartment, her classes, the comforting anonymity of being a broke college student, had just vanished. The days that followed blurred into a strange, suffocating routine. She was moved into a minimalist suite that was larger than her entire apartment building. It had one window, overlooking the endless gray rooftops of a city, but it did not open. A silent woman with a severe haircut brought her meals. Her cleaning uniform was replaced with several identical sets of simple black trousers and gray shirts. Her phone was gone. Her laptop was gone. She was utterly disconnected from her world. Her only human contact was him. Every night, she would be escorted down to his office to clean. He was often there, working at his desk, the glow of his monitor casting sharp shadows on his face. He rarely spoke to her, but she felt his eyes on her constantly. She learned the rhythm of his presence, the quiet scratch of his pen on paper, the soft click of his mouse, the way he would sometimes stare out at the city for long stretches, his thoughts 1,000 miles away. She was his ghost, and she haunted his world, polishing his desk, emptying his trash, mopping the floors where men had likely died. And in her haunting, she began to see things. She saw the immense pressure he was under, the endless stream of severe-looking men who came and went, their faces grim. She saw the flashes of violence that simmered just beneath his controlled surface, the way his knuckles would tighten on a pen, the cold fire that would enter his eyes during a particularly tense phone call. But she also saw other things. Small, human things she wasn't supposed to notice. There was a photograph on his desk, always kept face down. For weeks, it was just an object, a black frame she dusted around. But one night, he was on a call, his back to the desk, his voice a low, angry torrent of Japanese. He paced, agitated, and in his distraction, she saw the frame had been knocked slightly. The photograph was visible. It was a woman, Japanese, with a smile that was bright and unburdened. She was standing in a field of flowers, her hair blowing in the wind. She looked happy.
Free.
Everything this world was not. Jade felt a strange pang of sorrow for this unknown woman. He ended his call and turned, and his eyes immediately went to the photograph, then to her. She froze, her hand hovering over the desk with a dust cloth. She expected anger, a cold reprimand. Instead, she saw a flicker of raw, unguarded pain in his eyes. It was there for only a second before the mask of indifference slammed back down, but she had seen it. He walked to the desk and picked up the frame, his thumb tracing the edge. Her name was Akari, he said, his voice quiet. He didn't look at her, only at the photo. She liked flowers. She believed there was good in everyone, even me. He paused, and the silence was filled with a grief so profound it seemed to suck the air from the room. She was killed 5 years ago. A car bomb meant for me. They used her to get to me, to make me reckless. It worked. He set the photo back down firmly, face down. She paid the price for her belief. It is a mistake I do not allow others to make around me anymore. That was the first crack in his armor. It wasn't a confession of love. It was a confession of failure. A wound that had never healed. He was not just a monster carved from ice. He was a man haunted by a ghost of his own. And in that moment, Jade felt a sliver of something other than fear for him. It was a dangerous, unwelcome empathy. The danger he lived with soon bled into her gilded cage. A few nights later, while she was cleaning the windows of his office, she saw it. A tiny, brilliant red, dancing on the glass directly over his heart as he stood across the room, reading a document. Her mind didn't have time to process the fear. Competence under pressure. Act first, think later. Get down. The words ripped from her throat, raw and loud. She didn't wait for him to react. She launched herself away from the window, grabbing the heavy, metal mop bucket and heaving it with all her strength. It crashed against the base of his obsidian desk, the resounding boom echoing like a gunshot. Ryosuke moved with a speed that was inhuman. He didn't look for the source of the noise. He reacted to her warning. He dropped, rolling behind the desk just as the floor-to-ceiling window behind him exploded inwards, a spiderweb of cracks appearing an instant before a sniper's bullet punched a hole through the air where he had just been standing. Glass rained down on the marble floor. An alarm began to shriek somewhere in the building. Ryosuke was already on a small communications device, speaking rapid, clipped Japanese. His men would be swarming the building in moments. Jade was on the floor, huddled behind a leather sofa, her heart trying to beat its way out of her chest. Shards of glass were scattered around her like diamonds. She had just saved the life of one of the most dangerous men in the city. The immediate threat passed. The alarm was silenced. His men, silent and efficient, secured the floor. Ryosuke walked over to where she was still crouched, his own face pale beneath its usual stoicism. He looked at the shattered window, then back at her. He crouched down, his movements fluid, until they were at eye level. "You saved my life," he stated. It wasn't a question. She could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before his fingers brushed a shard of glass from her hair. His touch was unexpectedly gentle. His eyes, usually so cold and distant, were fixed on her with a raw intensity she had never seen before. It was gratitude, but it was something more, something deeper and more complicated. "The risk to you has just escalated," he said, his voice low, for her alone. "They have seen you. They will assume you are important to me." In that moment, huddled on the floor amidst the wreckage, with the smell of cordite in the air and the city lights twinkling through a shattered window, the line between captor and protector blurred. He had trapped her in his world, but she had just anchored herself to his survival. She could have let the bullet find him. She could have stayed silent. But she hadn't. She had made a choice. She had tied her fate to his. And looking into his dark, intense eyes, she realized with a terrifying clarity that she didn't regret it. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now intertwined with a strange, burgeoning sense of purpose. She was no longer just the cleaner. She was the ghost who had screamed. The attack changed everything. The illusion of her being just a piece of the furniture was shattered, both for her and for his enemies. Ryosuke moved her from the residential suite to a room adjoining his own penthouse, a space protected by layers of security she couldn't even comprehend. The pretense of her being a cleaner was all but gone. She was now, officially, under his personal protection. A ward, a prisoner, a complication. His rival, a man named Kuroda, was the one responsible for the sniper. Ryosuke's world, once a quiet hum of menace in the background of her life, was now the roaring, immediate foreground. She saw the cost of his war. Men came back to the penthouse injured, their faces grim. The atmosphere was thick with strategy and the constant threat of violence. Jade found herself in a state of suspended animation. She had no duties, no purpose other than to exist within the luxurious confines of the penthouse. The boredom was maddening. She had been a student, her mind constantly working, solving problems. Here, her mind had nothing to do but watch and worry. One evening, Ryosuke was in a meeting in the main living area, his voice a low, intense rumble along with those of his lieutenants. He had left his personal study unlocked. A laptop was open on his desk, displaying what looked like financial data streams, a complex web of numbers and symbols flowing across the screen. She knew she shouldn't, but she was drawn to it. She was a data analytics minor, fascinated by patterns. This was a language she understood. She stood in the doorway, watching the screen. Most of it was encrypted, but she saw something in the raw data flow, a tiny, repeating anomaly. A packet of information that was being rerouted through a server in Eastern Europe, a digital fingerprint so small and elegant it was almost invisible. It was a leak. A slow, methodical bleed. His men, experts in violence and intimidation, would never see it. They looked for bombs and bullets. This was a different kind of weapon. She heard the meeting ending. She had to make a choice. To retreat back to her room and say nothing, or to step over a line she could never uncross. To become an accomplice. Ryosuke entered the study, his expression tight with frustration. He saw her standing there, and his eyes narrowed. "What is it?" She pointed to the screen. "You have a leak," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "It's small. A ghost process. It's rerouting micropackets of transactional data. Whoever it is, they're not stealing money. They're mapping your entire financial network." He walked to the desk, his eyes scanning the screen. He followed her finger as she pointed out the repeating code string. He stood there for a full minute, silent, his focus absolute. Then he typed a few commands, his fingers flying across the keyboard. A new window opened, confirming her analysis. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a grudging respect in his eyes. He wasn't just looking at a cleaner or a liability. He was looking at an asset. "Kuroda," he said, the name a curse. "He's smarter than I gave him credit for." He picked up his phone and issued a series of quiet, lethal orders. The leak would be stopped. But more than that, it would be used. They would feed it false information, lead Kuroda into a trap of their own making. Jade had just done something morally gray, something that actively aided a criminal organization. She had crossed a line. But as she watched him work, a cold certainty settled in her. She had done it to protect the fragile stability of this cage, which had, by necessity, become her world. She had done it to protect him. The trap was set. Ryosuke planned to meet Kuroda's people for a supposed truce at a location they believed was secure because of the data they had stolen. But it was a kill box of Ryosuke's own design. He gave Jade access to the penthouse security feeds before he left. "Stay here. Lock the doors. Do not open them for anyone but me," he commanded. She watched him leave, his men flanking him, all of them dressed in dark suits, moving like specters. An hour later, she was watching the feeds from the warehouse district, her stomach in knots. She saw his convoy arrive. And then she saw the second convoy arrive, from the opposite direction. It was too many men. The false data had worked, but Kuroda wasn't just walking into the trap. He was bringing an army. It was an ambush. Panic seized her. Ryosuke's men were good, but they were outnumbered. She watched on the grainy monitor as the first shots were fired. It was chaos. She couldn't fight. She couldn't call for help. But she could think. Her mind raced back to the data streams, the building schematics she had glimpsed on his computer. The warehouse was old, but it was wired into the city's central grid. Her hands flew across the keyboard of the terminal in his study. She wasn't a hacker, not really, but she knew systems. She found a backdoor into the municipal works mainframe, a vulnerability she'd studied in a network security class. She navigated to the fire suppression systems for that specific city block. Her finger hovered over the command. This would create chaos. It would bring the fire department, the police, everyone. It would blow the entire operation, but it might give him the cover he needed to escape. She hit enter. On the monitor, she saw the warehouse's emergency lights begin to flash. Then the sprinklers kicked in, drenching everything and everyone in a torrent of water, ruining sightlines and creating pandemonium. It was the disruption he needed. She saw his men regroup, using the confusion to retreat, laying down covering fire. She saw a glimpse of Ryosuke, moving through the chaos, a phantom in the artificial rain, before the feed cut out. The next hour was the longest of her life. She sat in the silent penthouse, staring at a blank screen, not knowing if he was alive or dead. Then, she heard a key in the lock. The door opened and he stumbled in, leaning against the frame. His suit was soaked and torn, smeared with dirt and something dark that was likely blood. A deep cut bled freely on his cheek. He was alone. He looked at her, his chest rising and falling heavily. The mask was gone. In his eyes, she saw exhaustion, fury, and a bone-deep weariness. "You saw it," he said, his voice a raw rasp. "The fire system. That was you." She nodded, unable to speak. "I told you to stay here." To do nothing, he pushed himself off the doorframe and took a step towards her. He was limping slightly. "Why?" "I couldn't just watch you die," she whispered, the words tasting of fear and a truth she didn't want to examine too closely. He stopped in front of her, so close she could feel the cold dampness of his clothes, smell the rain, and the metallic tang of blood. He looked down at her, and the entire power dynamic between them seemed to shift, to invert on its axis. "In my life, people run. They hide. They pray to their gods," he said, his voice low and intense. "No one has ever intervened." He reached up, his rough fingers gently touching her cheek. His touch was a jolt, a brand. "You are a complication I did not plan for, Jade." It wasn't a declaration of love. It was something far more dangerous. It was an admission of fact, a confession of a vulnerability he never intended to have. In his world, complications were eliminated, but his eyes, dark and stormy, told her he had no intention of eliminating this one. The next day, the war became personal. A message was delivered to the penthouse. It was a single, unmarked envelope. Inside was a photograph. It was of her, walking across the UCLA campus, a textbook in her arms. It had been taken months ago, before her life had been stolen from her. On the back, a single word was written, soon. Kuroda didn't just know she existed anymore. He knew who she was. He was no longer targeting Ryosuke's asset. He was targeting Jade. The ghost was about to become the bait.